that involve the cessation of thought and thus the non-arising of thought. Here, non-arising doesn't refer to the non-arising of thought but to the non-arising of anything that can be identified as separate from the causes and conditions by means of which we say it arises. But saying that something arises does not mean there is something that exists apart from causes and conditions. Arising and non-arising are both fictions. 291 If one thing cannot be established, how can we possibly establish two things? 292 Most Chinese commentators take these three as examples of how we discriminate the day. Like samsara and nirvana, they are neither inside nor outside of each other, nor are they identical to each other. They are mutually exclusive and merely erroneous projections. 293 Shikshananda has, they only exist relative to each other and cannot exist alone. Outside of samsara there is no nirvana. And outside of nirvana there is no samsara. Samsara and nirvana are not separate. And as with samsara and nirvana, the same is true of everything else. This is what is meant by non-dual. 294 Section XXVIII. Previously, Mahamati wonders if the Buddha's teaching is not nihilistic, now he wonders if the Buddha's teaching is not eternalistic, and if the teaching of the tathagata-garbha does not run counter to the foregoing teachings of emptiness, non-arising, and no self. The Buddha explains how the tathagata-garbha is not the same as a self but rather an expedient means used to attract those who cling to a self by providing something less frightening than no self. 295 In this sutra, the tathagata-garbha, womb of Buddhas, is treated as the same as the alaya-vijnana, repository. Consciousness, two sides of the same coin. Elsewhere, it is linked with the dharma body, hidden, it's the tathagata-garbha, visible, it's the dharma body. 296 The bodies of all Buddhas are said to be marked by 32 physical attributes, such as long arms and long earlobes, webbed fingers and toes, a swastika in the middle of the chest, a curl between the brows, and eyes the shape of a crescent moon. In the case of the tathagata-garbha, however, physical attributes no longer apply, and a series of epithets are used instead, such as emptiness, etc. 297 This is one of 9 similes used in the tathagata-garbha Sutra. Others liken the tathagata-garbha to gold in a mine or seeds in a flower. 298 These are also known as the three poisons. 299 The Buddha varies his description of the tathagata-garbha depending on the attachments of his audience. For those attached to existence, the tathagata-garbha is empty, formless, or intentionless. For those attached to non-existence, the tathagata-garbha is the realm of reality, the dharma nature, or the dharma body. For those attached to existence and non-existence, it is nirvana, the absence of self-existence, or what neither arises nor ceases. And for those attached to neither existence nor non-existence, it is original quiescence or intrinsic nirvana. 300 The gate of threefold liberation includes emptiness, formlessness, and intentionlessness. As the Buddha notes earlier in this section, these are also other names for the tathagata-garbha. 301 The Sanskrit is tathagata-niritmaya-garbha. 302 Section XXIX. Short though this section is, the Buddha manages to list the major conceptions of a self held by other paths, something that continues from one life to the next, something that results from a combination of matter and conditions, or something created by an outside force, all of which are nothing more than fictions. 303 Gunabhadra alone renders this in 4 character lines. 304 Section XXX. These are the highlights of the Bodhisattva path leading to the tathagata-garbha, beginning with seeing that there is nothing to see other than one's own mind, svasiddhidrishya matra, and concluding with the personal realization of what Buddhas know, svapratitma-arya-jnana, to which is added the means to teach such realization to others. 305 The practices of realization, yoga abhisamaya, recall the Bodhisattva's lineage of realization, abhisamaya-gatra, in section XX. 306 Sanskrit texts have abhilashanata, desiring, which is reflected in Shikshananda's translation. However, both Bodhiruchi and Gunabhadra have le, delighting. 307 Although these four practices are usually interpreted as sequential, they are also viewed as simultaneous, as becoming aware of one's own mind necessarily entails transcending limitations of space and time and experiencing what can only be experienced by oneself. 308 Gunabhadra repeats this sentence a second time in slightly altered form. I've followed Bodhiruchi and Shikshananda, neither of whom includes the repetition. 309 This paragraph is rendered quite differently by each translator. As elsewhere, I've followed Gunabhadra. 310 This unusual term, Manomayakaya, is further explained in section LVII, where three projection bodies are mentioned, one acquired during the third, fourth, or fifth stages of the Bodhisattva path, one at the 8th stage, and one beyond the 8th stage, apparently at the 10th stage. 311 Gunabhadra omits Mahamati asked the Buddha, but this is present in Bodhiruchi, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit. Hence, I have added it. I've also followed Bodhiruchi, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit for Mahamati's question. Gunabhadra has, what is the reason for the projection body? 312 Section XXXIII. It was the understanding of causation that formed the basis of the Buddha's own enlightenment. Mahamati, too, seeks to understand causation. However, from the point of view in this sutra, cause and effect are considered in terms of their origin as projections, not in terms of whether one exists or not or what their temporal or spatial relationship might be. 313 The question revolves around this issue: does the effect exist in the cause, simultaneous, or are they separate, sequential? The Sanskrit terms are krama, sequential, and yugapat, simultaneous. Mahamati's question anticipates the Buddha's answers. 314 External conditions make up the world in which most people live, while they remain unaware that what exists in that world and what causes it to exist are merely perceptions of their own mind. Internal conditions constitute the world of Hinayana practitioners, the foolish people here, unaware that what exists and what causes it to exist are merely perceptions of their own mind. Internal conditions are usually encompassed by the 5 skandhas or the 12 links of dependent origination, beginning with ignorance and karma, memory, and ending with illness, old age, and death. 315 The subject of causality and different lists of causes fill the texts of every Buddhist sect. This particular list is apparently unique to this sutra. 316 Referring to the latent habit energy of the repository consciousness. 317 Yin Shun gives the example of the sun. After it goes down, it is the inactive cause of its reappearance. 318 This set of 4 causes, which considers causation from the point of view of the effect, is common to early Hinayana texts. 319 All 3 Chinese translations and the Sanskrit render this verse in 6 lines. 320 Section XXXII. Mahamati's question here arises from the last line in the previous section, where the Buddha says, "Nothing exists at all / and these are nothing but words." So how are we to understand words, and where do they come from? The Buddha says that words are based on projections, and projections are a falsification of reality. Hence, to know the truth behind words requires seeing through the falsehood of projection. 321 The Sanskrit for words and what they express are abhilapa, expression, and abhilapya, expressed. These are the 2 kinds of truth, artha, the validity of which the Buddha denies in the next section. 322 These 4 are associated with different forms of consciousness: object projection with the first 5 forms of sensory-based consciousness, dream projection with the 6th, or conceptual consciousness, words for attachment to erroneous projections with the 7th, or self-consciousness, and words for beginningless projections with the 8th, or repository consciousness. 323 Some commentators think hostility here is short for hostility and kindness. But this is not supported by any of our texts. The Sanskrit has simply shatru, hostility, Gunabhadra has yuan, enmity, and Shikshananda has unchou, hatred. None include kindness. Bodhiruchi chooses not to translate Shatru at all. However, the place of hostility here is clearer when it is understood that it is based on the seventh form of consciousness, or ego consciousness. And wherever the ego is involved, hostility, and not kindness, is the operant emotion. 324 Section XXXIII. What is the relation between words and projections, between words and ultimate truth, Paramartha? Ultimate truth cannot be projected because it has no characteristics. Hence, it cannot be expressed or revealed by words. It can only be known by realizing that the projections of words are nothing but the perceptions of one's own mind. The Buddha's initial response here seems out of place. It also appears in section LXV, where it fits better. Hence, its appearance here is probably a copyist error. 325 Although Gunabhadra's translation of this line is a bit ambiguous, it is clearer in Bodhiruchi and Shikshananda, which have variations of because projection is the cause of words. 326 Section XXXIV. While this does summarize the foregoing, Gunabhadra's translation includes only these two verses. Bodhiruchi, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit include two more and handle the second verse quite differently. Weaving their versions together results in something like this: to whatever exists has no self-existence / avoid the projection of words / everything is a dream or illusion / neither samsara nor nirvana. 3 Just as a ruler or elder / tries to keep his children happy / giving them animals of clay at first / only later real ones, a story from the Lotus Sutra about the use of skillful means. 4 Thus do I teach my disciples / devices that make them happy / only later do I instruct them / to realize the realm of reality themselves. 327 The Sanskrit is buddhakoti, which means the boundary / limit / extent of what is real. This term is sometimes used as equivalent to nirvana, but in the Lankavatara it refers to what transcends nirvana and samsara and points to the tathagata-garbha as our primordial Buddha nature. Here, all three Chinese translators have shichi, limit of reality. 328 Section XXXV. The Buddha uses a series of 12 similes to exemplify the unreality of the four possible standpoints on which other paths based their sense of reality: this, that, either this or that, neither this nor that. Of the 12 similes, the first 7 are directed to followers of other paths and teach that perceptions of an external world are not real, thus there are no views to get free from. The remaining 5 are directed to Hinayana practitioners and teach that perceptions of an external world are nothing but mind, thus there is no Buddha knowledge to realize. 329 This version of the tetralemma common to logical schemes the world over, either X or Y, both X and Y, neither X nor Y, will be repeated throughout the rest of the sutra. While its use in logic is usually intended to establish the validity of one of the 4 possibilities, the Lankavatara uses it to dismiss all 4. Although the full tetralemma is only stated for the first series regarding spatial reality, it is implied for the remaining 2, which concern conceptual and temporal reality. 330 Gandharvas are gods known for their skill as musicians who are devoted to pleasure and who live in the sky. Thus, their cloud-like cities are often used as a metaphor for illusions. While the deer represent those who seek pleasure in the realm of desire, the Gandharvas represent those who seek pleasure in the realm of form. 331 While the first 2 similes involve the first 5 forms of sensory consciousness, dreams involve the 6th, or conceptual consciousness. 332 The reference here is to the 7th form of consciousness, which Hinayana monks seek to eliminate in order to enter nirvana. 333 The wheel, or firebrand, represents the wheel of birth and death. This paragraph is missing in Bodhiruchi. 334 The raindrops represent nirvana. 335 This refers to the first 6 forms of consciousness, the cessation of which was considered the prerequisite of nirvana by Hinayana practitioners. 336 The 3 means to knowledge of Samkhya epistemology include accepted authority, inference, or reasoning, and direct experience. 337 The five-part syllogism of Nihilogicians was a form of argument aimed at discovering the truth by means of proposition, reason, example, application, and conclusion. 338 Imagined reality and dependent reality are the two modes of reality referred to here. The Buddha's reference is to those who think perfected reality is real, and the text can be read as a critique of some Yogacarans in this regard. 339 This and the similes that follow are also taken as examples of the teachings of apparition Buddhas. Here, the Buddha is the tree, and the minds of beings are the water. 340 This refers to a Buddha's mind, which reflects without distinction. 341 This refers to a Buddha's oral teaching. 342 This refers to the appearance of teachings. 343 The Sanskrit is Arya Pratitmajnana Vastu. 344 This refers to the five skandhas and other conceptions of self-existence, including the body of a Buddha. 345 Pishacas are demons who have the ability to make the dead move as if they were alive. Here the Pishaka is Buddhata, or reality, and the power of incantation comes from alaya-vijnana, or repository consciousness. 346 And yet there is nothing attained, nothing abandoned. 347 This verse is expanded into two verses in Bodhiruchi Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit by applying these and other similes to the five skandhas as well as to the three realms. 348 The seeds of consciousness refer to habit energy in the repository consciousness. 349 In section XXVIII, the Buddha defines the three continuities as referring to greed, anger, and delusion, which are also known as the three poisons. 350 Referring to the skandhas, for example. 351 Section XXXVIII. The Buddha does not teach any of the four viewpoints that prevent personal realization of Buddha knowledge. In place of these, he teaches dependent origination, the path, cessation, and liberation. His aim is practical, not theoretical. He turns to whatever works. 352 This refers to the tetralemma, which is only spelled out in its entirety for sameness and difference. 353 Basically, this is a restatement of the Four Noble Truths. 354 This refers to the Buddha's 108 responses to Mahamati's 108 questions. A statement about X is a statement about no X. Teachings involving realms that are free from projections are presented to lead people away from their beliefs in the existence or the non-existence of things. 355 The paths of Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas are for eliminating the obstruction of passion, while the Bodhisattva path is for eliminating the obstruction of knowledge. 356 Tathagatas are likened to caravan chiefs because they lead practitioners across the desert of barren knowledge and because they know the location of the oases where they can rest on their way to liberation. The paths and its stages, along with the oases, however, are a mirage. 357 Section XXXVII. To eliminate the obstructions of passion and knowledge of the previous section, the Buddha lists four kinds of meditation, one for Hinayana practitioners and members of other paths, one for beginning bodhisattvas, one for accomplished bodhisattvas, and one for those who transcend the bodhisattva path. Thus, the practice of meditation is viewed here as sequential, with the last kind tantamount to what later became known as direct understanding. 358 Bodhiruchi, Shikshananda, and the Sanskrit read this differently, until they reach the cessation of perceptions, which is the goal of Hinayana practitioners. 359 The Sanskrit is Arthapravikayadhyana, meaning examination. Meditation. 360 The Sanskrit is Tathagata-garbha, suchness-based meditation. The object of this meditation is the teaching itself as a projection. 361 No self among persons and no self among things. 362 The threefold bliss of samadhi, enlightenment, and nirvana. 363 The Sanskrit is patala, referring to that region of the underworld that is the home of serpents and demons. 364 After the kalpa-ending conflagration that destroys all worlds. 365 All versions render this verse in 6 lines. 366 Section XXXVIII. Reflecting on the threefold bliss of personal realization that marks Tathagata meditation, Mahamati asks about the bliss of nirvana. The Hinayana view is that nirvana is the extinguishing of consciousness and the end of birth and death. Here, the Buddha says nirvana is not something outside birth and death but rather the transformation of birth and death, the transformation of the 8 forms of consciousness into the 4 kinds of non-discriminating wisdom, the wisdom of perfect accomplishment, sensory consciousness, the wisdom of perfect observation, conceptual consciousness, the wisdom of perfect equanimity, will or self-consciousness, and the wisdom of perfect reflection, repository consciousness. 367 Permanence is a characteristic. If nirvana is free from characteristics, it cannot be permanent. 368 If nirvana is what all Buddhas realize, it cannot be impermanent. 369 Of the dozens of dharmas listed by the various schools of Buddhism, those that were considered asanskrita, uncreated or unconditioned, included space, 2 kinds of cessation, and nirvana. 370 The Sanskrit has no meaning, nirartha, but none of the 3 Chinese translations agree. 371 That is, projections of conceptual consciousness. 372 Section XXXIX. Practitioners unable to transform the habit energy of self-existence continue to see nirvana in terms of words or objective states and thus fail to realize nirvana. 373 Section XL. Even the most advanced bodhisattvas rely on the powers of the tathagatas to assist and protect them, which tathagatas accomplish by appearing before them during meditation and by instructing them by means of wordless transmission. 374 The Sanskrit is adhisthana, enabling or supporting powers, Suzuki has sustaining. 375 Wordless transmission or empowerment is a custom common to many spiritual traditions whereby the touching of the forehead is considered tantamount to opening a third eye. 376 A samadhi marked by emptiness and the absence of form and intention. 377 This bodhisattva appears in the Avatamsaka Sutra, Chapter 26, and is supported by the Buddha in teaching the Dharma at the beginning stage of his practice. The initial stage of the bodhisattva path in this sutra is the 8th stage, where Shravakas and bodhisattvas normally, but not always, part company. 378 The Sanskrit is piksha-vipaksha, with and without wings. 379 The 10th and final stage of the bodhisattva path. 380 Michalaya champaka, a member of the magnolia family. Its orange-tinted blossoms are used in the production of perfumes in India. 381 Chief of the gods who dwell atop Mount Sumeru. 382 Bodhiruchi and Shikshananda add to transmit their power. 383 Based on usage here and elsewhere in this sutra, this would include the 8th, 9th, and 10th stages of the Bodhisattva path. 384 Section XLI. Mahamati asks the Buddha to explain how his teaching of causation differs from that of other paths and even wonders if it is not inferior. The Buddha redirects Mahamati's attention to the source of cause and effect and the source of views about them. 385 The Sanskrit is pratitya-samitpada. This was the basis of the Buddha's enlightenment and the focus of his early teachings. 386 The meaning of this last phrase is unclear, or at least ambiguous, in Gunabhadra. Bodhiruchi interprets this self here as referring to self-generated projections, which would be a misunderstanding of the Buddha's position in this sutra, while Shikshananda reads it as referring to an underlying self-existent substance of some kind, which is more likely. 387 The Buddha's teaching of dependent origination, or 12 links of the chain of existence, begins with ignorance and continues with memory, consciousness, name, and form, the inside and outside of the individual, sense organs, contact, sensation, desire, grasping, existence, birth, and old age and death. The problem that Mahamati sees with this explanation of cause and effect is that while ignorance is the cause of memory, old age and death is the cause of ignorance. Mahamati sees circularity as a non-solution. 388. The Sanskrit version of this classic formula is Asmin Sati Idam Bhavati. 389. Mahamati sees another problem in the Buddha's teaching. Do things come to exist gradually or suddenly, as the Buddha's formula implies? 390. Mahamati sees the causation of other schools as simpler and clearer. A supreme deity gives rise to things, and that is that. Things do not give rise to a supreme deity. Nor does an effect become a cause, as in the Buddha's teaching. 391. That is, once the effect appears, it becomes the cause of a new effect. 392. Section XLII. Having heard the Buddha speak of the existence and non-existence of external objects, Mahamati wonders about their relation to words and suggests words establish the reality of objects. The Buddha divests him of such a view. Words are not connected to anything other than the imagination that gives rise to them, and they are not essential for communication, in this or in other worlds. So much for their connection to reality. 393. Shikshananda omits this last sentence. 394. These terms were used by philosophers to argue about existence and non-existence. 395. This is one of the names of a Buddha land to the east over which Akshobhya Buddha presides. 396. This bodhisattva is often depicted riding an elephant and known for his use of skillful means rather than doctrines in teaching the Dharma. 397. The three realms of desire, form, and formlessness through which one passes life after life. The reference here is also to the burning house in the Lotus Sutra which foolish children refuse to leave until the Buddha entices them out with carts. 398. Section Slyeen. The Buddha explains delusion. The foolish are misled by it, lesser practitioners try to annihilate it, and the wise transform it into suchness. In the background here is the Buddha's teaching that beyond the mind there are no things and beyond things there is no mind. 399. Bodhiruchi and Shikshananda read this as a rhetorical question and put it in the Buddha's mouth. The contention that speech was eternal, Nityashavda, is traced back to Katyayana, a Sanskrit grammarian and mathematician who flourished about 150 BC and who held that the sacred syllables of Sanskrit were indestructible and alone capable of expressing the truth. The Buddha, however, is not interested in the status of speech as eternal, but in delusion, of which speech is an example. According to the Buddha, speech is eternal as long as it is not a projection. As soon as it is a projection, it either exists or does not exist and is not eternal. 400. By delusion, by tranti, is meant what the mind gives rise to. When people add their projections to what the mind gives rise to, they cannot help but misrepresent it. And in so doing, they become attached to their misrepresentations. The wise don't add projections to what the mind gives rise to but accept it for what it is, the mind. Hence, for them delusion becomes reality. 401. What humans see as water, pretas, hungry ghosts, see as fire. 402. The Sanskrit is tattva. 403. Foolish people do not distinguish individual or shared characteristics, only a world of objects. Such objects, however, are delusions, mistaken judgments as to what is real. Shravakas distinguish characteristics rather than objects but cannot see past characteristics. The same is true for Pratyeka Buddhas, who seek to get free of such characteristics. Only those wise enough to see objects and characteristics as delusions and merely the perceptions of their own minds can remain detached from them and cease creating the projections that conjure them into existence. Delusions, for the wise, thus become real by means of the transformation of their awareness. 404. The three modes of reality and the five dharmas are meant. The Sanskrit for suchness is tathagata. Earlier, the Buddha says the transformation of the habit energy of the mind is nirvana. Here it is suchness. Just different words.